The first thing they noticed was the silence. Not the kind that brought peace, but the kind that made the skin crawl. The absence of hums, the lack of distant beeps, the unsettling void where sound should be. The ship, a hulking mass of dark metal drifting through space, had been sending distress signals for the last 6 hours. But now, as the team stepped inside, the signals had stopped. A single corridor stretched ahead, dim emergency lights flickering along the floor, casting jagged shadows on the walls. The air was thick with something they couldn't quite place, not dust, not smoke, but something heavier. Something wrong. "Stay close," the lead officer murmured, gripping his sidearm tighter. His voice barely rose above a whisper, though no one had told him to be quiet. It was just the kind of place that made a person feel like shouting would wake something better left undisturbed. The crew of the retrieval team had been sent to investigate a standard distress call. Simple protocol: board the ship, assess the situation, and bring back survivors if there were any. But as they moved deeper, their boots echoing against the metal, it became clear that this was no ordinary mission. The ship's design was unlike anything in their records. It looked human-made, at least, at first glance. But the walls seemed too smooth, the angles too sharp, the doors lacking any visible control panels. It was as if the ship had been built not just to house a crew, but to keep something hidden. The first door they encountered was sealed shut. No keypad, no manual override, just a solid slab of metal with no indication of how it was meant to open. One of the team members, an engineer, ran a hand over its surface, frowning. "No seams," he muttered. "No weld marks. It's like it was never meant to be opened." That was when the sound came. Not from behind the door, but from somewhere deeper in the ship. A scraping noise, slow and deliberate, like metal dragging against metal. It wasn't the groan of shifting hull plates or the whine of cooling systems. It was something else. Something alive. The lights flickered, and for a split second, the corridor ahead stretched into darkness. The scraping stopped. A pause, then a distant clang, like something heavy dropping onto the floor. "Anyone else feeling like we should leave?" Someone muttered. No one laughed. Pushing forward, they reached another door, this one slightly ajar. A dim light pulsed from within, casting a dull red glow onto the floor. The lead officer hesitated, then signaled the engineer to pry it open. As the door groaned on unseen hinges, a sharp, metallic scent filled the air. Inside, the room was small, lined with control panels covered in static-filled screens. And in the center, a single chair, facing away. Straps dangled from its sides, broken. Something had been sitting there. Recently, a monitor sparked to life, static clearing just enough to reveal a distorted figure. A voice, garbled but desperate, whispered through the speakers. They locked the doors for a reason. The screen went black. Then, from the corridor, they had just come through footsteps. Slow, measured, coming closer, and the door behind them, slamming shut. The heavy clang of the door slamming shut sent a ripple of panic through the team. Someone swore under their breath. The lead officer spun around, gripping his weapon tighter, but there was no one there. Just the empty corridor, stretching back the way they came, the emergency lights flickering erratically, as if something unseen had disturbed the ship's fragile power systems. The engineer rushed to the door, running his hands along the edges, searching for a panel, a switch, anything. "It's locked. There's no manual release," he said, his voice strained. "We're trapped." The lead officer pressed a comm button on his wrist. "Command, this is Recon Team. We've got a situation. Do you copy?" Nothing. He tried again. Static. Another voice, one of the other crew members, barely above a whisper. "What the hell is going on?" No one had an answer. The room around them was still, but something about it felt off, like the air was too thick, pressing down on them. The chair in the center, the one with the broken straps, sat facing a dark screen. The monitor that had come to life moments ago was now nothing but dead glass, its surface slightly cracked. And then another noise. A low creak, like shifting weight. The engineer turned sharply, his eyes scanning the room. "Did you hear that?" No one responded, but they had all heard it. The lead officer motioned for silence, lifting his weapon slightly, stepping toward the doorway. The air was so quiet now that he could hear his own breath, slow and steady, despite the hammering in his chest. He took another step, then another. And then the chair moved. Not much, just a slight shift. Enough to make a sound. Enough to make them all freeze. The lead officer lifted his weapon. "Turn it around." The engineer hesitated. "What if?" "Turn it around," the officer repeated, his voice firm, though there was an edge to it. Swallowing hard, the engineer reached out, his fingers gripping the back of the chair. Slowly, carefully, he turned it. Nothing. The seat was empty. The straps hung limp, frayed at the edges. There were dark stains on the armrests, too dark to be rust. The engineer exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead. "This place is messing with us." Another crew member, a woman standing near the console, stared at the monitor. That message, "They locked the doors for a reason." What does that mean? No one answered. The officer took a step back, his boots making a soft scuff against the floor. "We need to find another way out of here. Keep your eyes open." We moved together. He turned to the engineer. "Any chance we can force the door?" The engineer hesitated, glancing at it. "Maybe. But without a visible lock mechanism, I don't know how it's sealed. Could be pressure locked, magnetically sealed, or something else entirely." "Try," the officer said. The engineer set down his pack and pulled out a small handheld tool. A low hum filled the air as he pressed it against the edge of the door, trying to find a weak point. And then, from the corridor outside, a whisper. Faint, garbled, but close. The woman near the console took a step back. Did that come from the comms? "No," the officer said, his voice tight. "That was outside." Another whisper. This time, closer. The engineer stopped working, his hands shaking slightly. That sounded like my name. No one spoke. The officer turned his head toward the door, listening. Silence. And then, softly, directly outside, a knock. Just one. Sharp. Deliberate. The woman inhaled sharply. "Nope. No. No way." The officer motioned for quiet, raising his weapon toward the door. He stepped forward slowly, pressing a gloved hand against the cold metal. Then, something scraped against the other side. Slow. Dragging. The whisper returned, just barely audible. "Let me out." The engineer stumbled backward, his face pale. "We need to go. Now?" The officer stayed still, heart hammering against his ribs. The door, still locked, rattled slightly. Not enough to open. Not enough to break. Just enough to let them know something was there. Something waiting. The lights flickered again, longer this time. The emergency glow sputtered, casting erratic shadows across the room. The officer turned sharply to the woman at the console. "Is there another exit?" She was already scanning the room, looking for vents, panels, anything. Her fingers moved over the dead monitors, searching for a power switch. If they could get some kind of control back. The whisper came again. This time, inside the room. It was right behind them. The woman gasped, spinning around, eyes darting wildly. But there was no one there. The chair stood empty. The screens remained dark. The door was still sealed, but the air had changed. It felt thicker, heavier, like something unseen had just stepped inside. The officer turned to the engineer, his voice tight. "Work faster." The engineer didn't need to be told twice. His hands moved quickly, pressing tools against the seam of the door, trying to force a release. But whatever held it shut was stronger than it should have been. The whisper came again. A single word. Wait. This time, they all heard it. And then, the lights went out completely. For a split second, everything was silent. And then, a sharp, metallic screech. Something moving. Too fast. Too close. And then, a breath right next to the officer's ear. The darkness swallowed them whole. For a few agonizing seconds, there was nothing, no sound, no light, just the heavy, suffocating stillness pressing against them like a living thing. Someone sucked in a sharp breath, but no one spoke. Even the engineer, who had been frantically working on the door, had frozen, his tool still humming faintly in his trembling grip. Then movement. A rustle. A shift in the air. Not footsteps exactly, but something close. The lead officer tightened his grip on his weapon, eyes wide in the dark. His pulse pounded in his ears, making it impossible to tell if the sound was coming from outside the room or inside it. Then, something brushed against his shoulder. Light. Barely there. He swung his weapon up instinctively, his breath catching in his throat. Silence. Then the emergency lights flickered just for a second, just long enough to catch a glimpse of something at the edge of his vision. A shadow. Not a person. Not quite. Something tall. Too tall. Its form stretched unnaturally against the dim red glow before the lights died again, plunging them back into blackness. A sharp, panicked gasp came from the engineer. "Something's in here," he whispered. No one needed to be told. They all felt it. The officer took a slow step backward, pressing against the cold wall. "Everyone stay close," he whispered. "No sudden movements." The whisper came again, soft but close. "Why did you come?" The engineer let out a strangled sound, barely holding back a panicked cry. The woman near the console was breathing heavily, her fingers gripping the edge of the dark screen as if anchoring herself in place. The whisper shifted, circling them in the blackness. "You shouldn't be here." A sharp creak came from the far side of the room. The chair. It was moving again. The woman sucked in a breath. "This isn't real," she muttered, as if saying it would make it true. The officer clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. "We need power," he said. "Get those screens online." The engineer, still shaking, fumbled for his tools. I think the backup generator is still active. If I can find the relay." The whisper turned into a low hum. Not quite speech. Not quite sound. The officer glanced toward the darkness, pulse hammering. "Do it fast." The engineer dropped to his knees, feeling blindly along the base of the console. His fingers found a panel, pulling it open with shaking hands. The hum grew louder. Then, a spark. The emergency lights stuttered again, holding for just a moment longer than before. Enough time to see. The chair was empty, but the straps were now fastened. Pulled tight, as if something invisible was sitting there. The officer's breath caught. Then the woman gasped. "Look." She was pointing past the chair, past the door. At the window. The glass was dark, reflecting the dim red light of the emergency system. But for just a second, when the flicker passed, there was something else in the reflection. A figure. No, not a figure. Figures. Dozens. Standing just outside the door, their shapes barely visible, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. The officer spun, weapon raised. But when he turned toward the door itself, nothing. No one was there. The reflection had lied. Or worse, it hadn't. The engineer let out a sharp breath. "I've got it." Another spark. Then, with a loud crackle, the console flickered to life. A static-filled screen cast weak, pale light across the room. And then the door. Unlocked. The officer didn't hesitate. "Move!" The team surged forward, the engineer nearly tripping over himself as the woman yanked him by the arm. The officer was last, stepping through the threshold just as a sound rumbled behind them. The chair, snapping upright. The whisper followed them, rising into something like a distorted voice. "Come back." Then the doors slammed shut behind them. The corridor ahead was just as dark, just as broken. But they were moving now. Fast. The officer glanced back only once. The window in the room they had left was now lit by the pale blue glow of the console. And in that glow, a single hand pressed against the glass. On the wrong side. The officer turned away, forcing his legs to keep moving. They needed to get out. But somehow, deep down, he already knew. The ship wasn't going to let them. The corridor stretched ahead, dimly lit by the weak emergency lights lining the floor. Their footsteps echoed too loudly, bouncing off the walls, making it impossible to tell if they were the only ones moving. The lead officer kept his weapon raised, scanning every shadow, every flicker of light, but the ship was silent again. That kind of silence that didn't mean safety, just waiting. The engineer was breathing heavily, his hands shaking as he clutched his toolkit. The woman kept glancing over her shoulder, her face pale. That wasn't just she started, but she didn't finish. The officer didn't let her. "Keep moving," he ordered. The door behind them had shut so violently that the metal frame had groaned under the impact. Whatever was in that room, whatever had whispered, whatever had left that handprint, wanted them to stay. And the ship was helping. They reached a junction where the corridor split in two directions. Both paths looked the same, dark, quiet, leading deeper into unknown territory. The officer hesitated, gripping his weapon tighter. Which way? The engineer swallowed. The ship's layout, it's not right. The structure doesn't match the schematics we received before boarding. The woman ran a hand through her hair, frustrated. "You're saying the ship is changing?" The engineer hesitated. "I'm saying, I don't know where we are anymore." A sharp noise farther down one of the hallways. A single metallic click, followed by a slow, steady dragging sound. They turned toward the noise instinctively. The officer raised a hand, signaling them to stay quiet. The dragging sound stopped. Then, a whisper. This time, it wasn't garbled. It wasn't distant. It was right behind them. "Don't leave." The woman gasped and spun around, but the corridor was empty. The officer's breath hitched. The engineer stumbled back a step. The whisper came again, this time from ahead of them. "Stay." Then the lights flickered. Just for a second. And in that second, something shifted. The hallway stretched. The walls seemed to pulse, expanding, narrowing. The floor felt unstable beneath their feet. The emergency lights along the floor flickered faster, their dull glow casting broken shadows across the walls. Then, the whisper changed. It became a voice. Not one. Many, layered over each other, overlapping in a tangled, distorted mess. Some were soft, some were frantic, some barely more than breath. But they all said the same thing. "Stay. Stay. 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 Stay." The officer clenched his jaw, pushing forward. "Move." The woman grabbed the engineer, pulling him along as they stumbled forward, deeper into the ship. The voices didn't stop. They grew louder, overlapping into something unnatural. Then, the lights died completely. The voices stopped, and the only thing left. Footsteps. Not theirs. Not close. Not yet. But coming. The woman's breathing was sharp, panicked. "We need to." Then, with a loud, piercing screech, something behind them moved. Fast. The officer turned just in time to see. Darkness rushing toward them. Not a shape. Not a person. Something else. The air turned ice cold. And then, a hand clamped around his wrist. Not human. Too long. Too strong. And pulling. Hard. The officer barely had time to react before the hand yanked him backward. His body jerked violently, his boots scraping against the metal floor as he fought against the impossible strength pulling him into the dark. He gritted his teeth, twisting hard, his free hand scrambling for something, anything to hold on to. But there was nothing, just cold air and an unseen force dragging him deeper into the ship. The woman screamed his name, lunging forward. She grabbed his arm, her grip tight, her face pale with terror. The engineer clutched onto her, anchoring them both. "Pull!" she shouted. The officer strained, every muscle in his body burning as he fought against whatever had him. It wasn't just pulling, it was trying to consume him, dragging him into something colder than the void outside the ship. The whispering started again, close now, wrapping around his ears like 1,000 voices speaking at once. "Let go." He clenched his jaw and did the opposite, digging his feet in, forcing himself forward. The woman pulled harder, her fingers slipping on his jacket. "I got you." Then, a sudden surge of movement. The force let go. The officer staggered forward, crashing into the woman, sending them both sprawling to the ground. The engineer stumbled back, his breathing ragged. For a brief moment, there was silence. The whispering stopped. The ship seemed to settle. And then, the officer saw his wrist, the place where it had grabbed him. His sleeve was torn, the fabric burned away in a perfect imprint of long, inhuman fingers. His skin beneath was ice cold, as if the blood had stopped flowing there. He stared at it, his breath coming in sharp gasps. It just felt wrong. The woman pushed herself up, her hands shaking. What the hell was that? The officer didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was racing. He looked back down the corridor, where the darkness still loomed, deep and endless. The whispering hadn't returned, but he knew it wasn't gone. It was just watching. The engineer swallowed hard. "We need to get to the bridge. Now." The officer nodded, forcing himself to move, forcing himself to ignore the unnatural cold spreading up his arm. They took off down the corridor, the flickering emergency lights casting long, warped shadows as they ran. The hallway twisted and turned, the layout still wrong, as if the ship itself was shifting around them. Then, they reached another door. It was slightly open, just enough for a thin sliver of darkness to seep through. The woman hesitated. "Do we?" A sound came from inside. Not whispering, not movement. A voice. Human. Weak. "Help me." The officer's stomach dropped. The woman stepped forward before he could stop her. "There's someone in there." The engineer grabbed her arm. "We don't know that." The voice came again, strained, desperate. "Please, I don't want to die in here." The officer's pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't like the whispering. This was different. Real. Or at least, it sounded real. The woman looked at him. "We can't just leave them." The officer hesitated. His gut screamed at him that something was wrong. But then, the voice said his name. Clear. Certain. "Help me." The officer's blood ran cold. The woman turned to him, confused. "Did you tell them your name?" He hadn't. And that's when he realized whoever was inside already knew him. And they were waiting. The officer's breath was shallow, his fingers tightening around his weapon. The name echoed in his head, twisting into something unnatural. His team was looking at him, waiting for a decision, but his instincts screamed that this was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. The woman stepped forward again, her hand reaching for the door. The engineer shook his head sharply. "Wait." Too late. The door slid open with a groan, revealing a dimly lit room. Wires hung loose from the ceiling, sparking faintly. The smell of burnt metal and something else, something rotten, filled the air. And in the middle of the room, slumped against the wall, was a man. His uniform was torn, blood staining the fabric. His breathing was ragged, barely there. His face was hidden in the shadows, but his body was shaking, his arms wrapped around himself as if trying to hold himself together. The woman hesitated. "Sir?" The man twitched. Slowly, painfully, he lifted his head. The officer's heart stopped, because he was looking at himself. Same uniform, same torn sleeve, same frozen imprint of fingers burned into his wrist. The injured man, his double, stared back at him with wide, hollow eyes. His mouth opened, cracked lips trembling as he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "You have to go." The officer took a step back. His mind refused to make sense of what he was seeing. "What?" The double shook his head weakly. "It's not a ship. It's a trap." The whispering returned. This time, it wasn't distant. It was everywhere. The walls trembled. The lights flickered violently. The ship shifted. The engineer cursed under his breath. "We need to leave. Now." The woman grabbed the officer's arm, snapping him out of his daze. But he couldn't look away from the man on the floor. His double. Him. "Listen to me," the double rasped. "You think you just got here. You didn't." His eyes were wild, desperate. "You've been here before. Over and over." His voice cracked. "And you never make it out." The officer's breath hitched. The ship groaned, the walls bending as if breathing. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, a chaotic storm of voices pushing against his skull. The double's fingers dug into the floor. "It keeps us. It doesn't let us go." His head dropped forward, voice barely audible now. "You have to run before it resets." The whispering turned into a roar. The ship screamed. The floor beneath them lurched. The officer staggered back, grabbing onto the woman and the engineer as the room twisted. The walls moved, stretching like living things. The doorway behind them began to close. The double looked up one last time, his expression hollow. "Don't let it start again." Then, the walls collapsed inward, swallowing him whole. The officer's world turned upside down as something ripped them backward. A force stronger than gravity itself, stronger than anything human, dragged them down the corridor. The lights shattered. The metal groaned like something alive. And then, silence. The officer gasped for breath, his back hitting cold metal. His eyes flew open. He was back in the airlock. The woman was next to him, coughing, dazed. The engineer was sprawled on the floor, staring blankly at the closed airlock door. The emergency lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows against the walls. It was as if nothing had happened, as if they had never left. The officer's stomach twisted. He turned to the woman. "Tell me you remember." Her wide, terrified eyes met his. Then, a familiar voice crackled over the ship's comms. "Docking complete. Welcome aboard." And the door in front of them unlocked. The officer's breath came in shallow gasps as the cold metal of the airlock pressed against his back. His mind raced, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. The woman was still next to him, gripping her knees, her face pale, eyes darting to the engineer, who sat frozen in place. The comms crackled again, repeating the same words in that familiar neutral tone. "Docking complete. Welcome aboard." The officer's hand instinctively reached for his weapon, but his fingers hesitated. What good had it done before? The ship, if it could even be called that, was playing a game. And they were the pieces. The engineer swallowed hard, shaking his head, as if trying to wake up from a dream. That didn't happen. Right? The woman gave him a sharp look. "You remember it?" Silence stretched between them. The officer slowly stood, his legs unsteady. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Everything looked the same. The airlock, the dim lights, the faint hum of the ship's systems running in the background. But it wasn't. He turned to the control panel. The timer on the screen was blinking, showing the exact moment they had supposedly docked. It hadn't moved. Not by a second. The ship had reset them. The double's last words came back to him. "You think you just got here? You didn't. You've been here before." A chill ran down his spine. They had done this already. Maybe more times than he could even remember. Maybe hundreds. Maybe thousands. And each time, the ship had pulled them back, wiping away the evidence, resetting the pieces, forcing them to start over. The woman stood, rubbing her arms as if trying to shake off the cold. So what do we do? If this thing keeps pulling us back, how do we stop it? The engineer ran a shaky hand through his hair. What if we can't? His voice was tight, barely above a whisper. What if this is it? What if we're meant to be here? The officer exhaled sharply, pushing past the growing panic clawing at his chest. No, that couldn't be true. There had to be a way out. He turned to the door. It was unlocked now, just like before. The ship wanted them to step through, to play along, to fall into the cycle again. The woman followed his gaze, her jaw tightening. We can't go back in there. The officer nodded. Not the way it wants us to. The engineer frowned. Then how? The officer's mind was racing, turning over every detail, every moment that felt different this time. The double. That hadn't happened before, or at least not in a way he could remember. The warning had been clear. Don't let it start again. Maybe the ship couldn't reset them if they did something it didn't expect. His eyes darted to the emergency panel near the airlock, a failsafe, meant to override every system and manually eject the docking bridge in case of a catastrophic failure. It was never supposed to be used except in life-threatening situations. This qualified. He moved toward it, his pulse hammering. The woman caught on immediately. You think that'll work? The engineer hesitated. If we break the connection, we might not have a way back to our own ship. The officer's fingers hovered over the control. If we don't, we'll never leave. That was the truth of it. This wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about breaking free. He flipped the safety cover open. A red warning flashed on the screen. Manual override engaged. Proceed? The whispers returned. Soft at first, curling around the edges of his thoughts like a distant echo. Then rising, desperate, angry. The lights flickered violently. The ship knew. Stay. The word came in layers, spoken in voices both familiar and unfamiliar. Some pleading, some furious. The walls groaned, a low, twisting sound that sent ice down his spine. The officer didn't hesitate. He pressed the override. A loud clank echoed through the airlock as the docking clamps released. The entire room lurched, metal groaning as the ship's grip was forcibly severed. The whispers turned into a scream, raw and deafening, vibrating through their skulls. Then, a sudden, violent pull. The airlock door slammed shut. The emergency lights flickered, alarms blaring as their ship jolted backward, breaking away from the black ship. The officer stumbled, gripping the wall for balance. The woman gasped, her hands gripping the nearest railing. The engineer slammed against the floor, letting out a sharp cry. The screen in front of them flashed erratically. The ship's autopilot kicked in, pulling them away, accelerating fast. Too fast. For a split second, the officer could see through the small viewport. The black ship was still there, still floating silently in the void, no longer connected to them, but it wasn't gone. The darkness around it seemed to shift, twisting like smoke, reaching. And then, it shrank. Not in size, in existence. Like a fading memory, like something being erased. One moment, it was there. The next, it was nothing. Gone. The ship's alarms slowly quieted. The shaking stopped. The lights returned to normal. Their ship was drifting, alone now, the black ship nowhere in sight. Silence settled over them. The woman let out a breath she had been holding, slumping against the wall. The engineer was still staring at the viewport, eyes wide, like he couldn't believe what he had just seen. The officer closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe. It was over. They had broken free. And yet, something still felt wrong. His fingers curled, and he felt it again. The cold spot on his wrist. The place where the black ship had touched him. His eyes snapped open. The woman was watching him, her expression wary. "It's over, right?" The officer hesitated. Then slowly, he looked at the control panel. The timer, the one that had been frozen at the moment they had docked. It was blinking, but not moving forward. It was counting down. His stomach dropped. The engineer followed his gaze and paled. "No, no, no." The woman's breath hitched. "What is that?" The officer's heart pounded as the realization sank in. They had broken free of the ship, but not of the loop, and the timer was about to hit 0.